There are a lot of myths out there about Palestine and Israel. That's because we are in the middle of a massive propaganda war. Because Israel depends a lot on support from the United States, what you believe about the origins of Israel and Palestine has a major influence on what exactly happens there today and tomorrow. And the propaganda I'm talking about is not only about events since 1948, I'm talking about events since 1948 BC. So let's correct some myths about the ancient history of Israel and Palestine. This is What, Why, How, and that's what the video's about. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out patreon.com/whatwhyhow. Okay, first, let's check out Ben Shapiro, who, if you don't know, is a major American conservative commentator, I guess you'd call him. Now first, Ben Shapiro is obviously on the Israel side of the issue. Back in 2003, he called for Israel to ethnically cleanse the area of its entire Arab Muslim population. Now, I don't know if he still believes that today, but that's the foundation Ben Shapiro is building his worldview on. So let's check out Ben Shapiro's video, You're Being Lied to About Israel and Palestine.
There are 4 myths generally propagated by the left around the history of Israel and the Palestinians. These myths matter because they lead people into a peculiar moral relativism whereby attempted murder or successful murder of Jews is excused, and meanwhile, the evil human rights violations of the Palestinians are minimized. Myth number 1. Israel.
Now, sorry to interrupt, but Ben Shapiro is obviously guilty of this from the other direction. Just the past year, Ben Shapiro gave buddy-buddy interviews to Benjamin Netanyahu, and he also strongly defended Israel's campaign against Gaza, which has killed at least 70,000 people, at least, and the IDF agrees with that number, by the way. So I don't think it's fair by any measure for Ben Shapiro to pretend he's not a partisan in this conflict. Anyways, Ben Shapiro is gonna present some quote-unquote myths, but then he responds to them with his own myths.
Myth number 1. Israel is historically Muslim territory. This is a pure and absolute lie. Israel is historically Jewish territory. According to the Bible and certain interpretations of contemporaneous archaeology, Joshua entered the land of Israel in 1400 BC. The Kingdom of David was founded around 1000 BC. The first Temple of Solomon was built in approximately 957 BC. The Second Temple was built in approximately 515 BC. The Hasmonean dynasty was founded in 166 BC. Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 BC, and the Jews exiled from Israel in 136 CE after the defeat of the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Romans, in an attempt to shame the Jews, renamed the area Palestine as an insult after the Jews' historic enemy, the Philistines.
Now, Ben Shapiro is trying to prove the claim that Israel was historically Jewish land and not historically Muslim land, or presumably historically Christian land, or historically polytheistic land. So it's not just it being Jewish land, but not the land of other people. He lists a bunch of events in ancient Jewish history according to the Hebrew Bible, then says the area was only named Palestine after the Philistines, the Jews' historic enemy, as if that's the only thing worth discussing about an entire ethnic group. But wait a second, who are the Philistines, or the Philistines? You can pronounce it different ways. He's right that the Philistines are the source of the name of modern-day Palestine, but it's a lot more complicated than he's presenting. Since Ben Shapiro relies on ancient history to justify the modern state of Israel, let's look deeper at that ancient history. So the Philistines were one of many non-Jewish ethnic groups that lived in the region for many centuries across the ancient period. Now we're going to focus on the Philistines for a little bit, but don't forget that there are other non-Jewish groups too, which I'll cover in a minute. And don't forget that modern-day Palestinians aren't exclusively the descendants of the ancient Philistines. That's not how it works. Now ironically, the Philistines probably lived about where Gaza is today, starting around 3,000 years ago, according to the Oxford History of the Biblical World. The Philistines may have been partially responsible for the Bronze Age collapse, by the way, and they might have come from Greece, but that's a story for another time. So, the Philistines moved to the region about 3,000 years ago, around the same time the Temple of Solomon was built according to the Hebrew Bible. So already the statement the region was only named Palestine in 136 CE should raise some red flags. I mean, what else would you call that specific area the Philistines lived in if not Philistinia, i.e. Palestine? Now, Ben Shapiro says this same thing in another video.
The Bar Kokhba revolt was extremely damaging to the Roman Empire. They had to expend extraordinary resources in order to stop the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is why it was almost an independent kingdom for a solid 4 or 5 years there. They renamed the area Palestine as an insult to the Jews. That's why it was named Palestine. So when people say historic Palestine, understand that the existence of Palestine was meant as a name, as an insult to the Jews, who were considered the historic inhabitants of the land, and it is first used in 136 CE, a solid 1,200 years after the Jews first enter the land at a minimum. Now, finally.
So here's the truth of the situation. The Roman Empire did rename the province Judea to a new name, Syria Palestina. You can count that as an insult, but this is far from the earliest use of the name Palestine. The ancient Assyrians used the name Palashtu to describe part of the region nearly 1,000 years before this. Even Herodotus, the ancient Greek father of Western history, used the name Palestine to describe an area in the Levant. Even the Hebrew Bible, by the way, refers to the region of Philistia, or Peleshet, where the Philistines lived. So while the Romans changed their province name to strip it of its specific association with Jewish people, the name Palestine was not invented then. This is just factually untrue. It was used centuries beforehand. Now, obviously, the reason Ben Shapiro made this claim is because he wants to minimize and denigrate Palestine as much as possible. If Palestine only exists as a word, as an insult to Jewish people, then perhaps there shouldn't be a Palestine, right? Well, except that's not true. But let's get back to the broader myth that Ben Shapiro is trying to build, that the region was historically Jewish territory to the exclusion of other groups, i.e. it was only historically Jewish territory and not historically Muslim territory or anybody else's. Well, we just talked about the Philistines, didn't we? Ben Shapiro brought them up, and they controlled plenty of land for most of the history he talks about. That's why they were enemies to the ancient Israelites. But they were far from the only non-Jewish group in the region, because as Ben Shapiro knows, the region was never exclusively Jewish. There was always a non-Jewish population. Even if you rely on the biblical narrative of the Jews arriving to the area from Egyptian enslavement, the land was obviously inhabited by people before they got there. Shapiro is definitely familiar with the book of Joshua. Here's what it says. And Joshua said, "Hereby ye shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Hivites, and the Perizzites, and the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Jebusites." Those are all non-Jewish people who lived in the Promised Land before the ancient Israelites conquered the region, according to the Bible. Now you might say, who cares about those guys? They were killed during the conquest, right? Well, no. Even after the conquest of the Holy Land, plenty of non-Jewish people remained there. The book of Kings says this, "And all the people that were left of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, which were not the children of Israel, their children that were left after them in the land, whom the children of Israel also were not able utterly to destroy, upon those did Solomon levy a tribute of bond service unto this day. But of the children of Israel did Solomon make no bondmen, but they were men of war, and his servants, and his princes, and his captains, and rulers of his chariots, and his horsemen." So clearly the Bible presents a more complicated story than just the region being Jewish territory. It was ruled by the Israelites, but had a large population of subjugated non-Israelite people. So why does this land count as historically Jewish territory and not historically Canaanite territory? The people that lived there alongside them. Is it because the ancient Israelites conquered and controlled the land, according to the Hebrew Bible? Well, obviously Ben Shapiro doesn't believe in the right of conquest, otherwise he'd have to say the region was actually historically Muslim land when they conquered it, or even historically Roman land, because the Muslims and the Romans conquered the region just as the Israelites did. Instead, Ben Shapiro has to look at a particular period of history, the period after the Israelites took control from all those other people, but before they lost control to the Romans and later the Muslims. Only that period, and none other, counts as historical. Why? That doesn't make any sense. When there's an inconsistency like this, it's pretty obvious the historical angle is just a ruse. Ben Shapiro isn't actually making a historical argument, he's making a religious argument in secret. He believes that the region was promised specifically to Jewish people by God, so the actual history is not very important to him and can just be used as a tool for the end destination that he already believes in as a matter of faith, not reason. But how accurate is the Hebrew Bible anyways? Where did ancient Israel come from? Did a bunch of Israelites really escape slavery in Egypt and conquer the Holy Land? Well, unfortunately for Ben Shapiro, there's just not archaeological or historical evidence of that. Now, the ancient Israelites did exist, but the biblical narrative probably isn't very accurate to what actually happened. Here's what the Oxford History of the Biblical World says. By the most generous interpretation of the archaeological data, the unified conquest hypothesis fails to meet the minimal standards of Criterion 1, i.e., the implanted culture must be distinguishable from the indigenous cultures in the new zones of settlement. What that quote means, what the book is saying, is that the biblical narrative is not very true to what actually happened. There just is not evidence that the Israelites swept into the Holy Land, defeated the natives, and settled there, replacing the indigenous culture. There's just not evidence of this, and there would be if it were true. Now again, the Israelites obviously did exist. On page 102, the book says, "The evidence from language, costume, coiffure, and material remains suggest that the early Israelites were a rural subset of Canaanite culture and largely indistinguishable from Transjordanian rural cultures as well." So the Israelites were natives. Now you might say, doesn't that undercut my argument? Well, you'll see what my argument actually is in a second. Here's what Philip R. Davies writes in his book, In Search of Ancient Israel, though. At the present time, there is a remarkable consensus among those few scholars who have specialized on the problem of these early settlers. I. Finkelstein, whose fieldwork has been crucial in establishing this consensus, sums up its lines as follows. There was no political entity named Israel before the late 11th century. The people who formed this entity came from diverse backgrounds, groups of sedentarizing nomads, withdrawing urban elements, northern people, groups from the southern steppe, etc. The settlement process was basically a peaceful one, with local skirmishes, especially in the later phase of the period. The ethnic lines between the settling groups were vague, and the ethnic affiliations merged together with the rise of the political powers. Most of the biblical material represents more the way that the Israelite origin was grasped in Jerusalem in the late monarchic period than an accurate account of the emergence of Israel. My point with these two passages from well-respected books on ancient Israel is that the boundaries between groups were not so black and white. When Ben Shapiro says that the region was historically Jewish territory, he's making an exclusive claim, that the land was exclusively Jewish territory, which just isn't true. In actuality, the ancient Israelites were not much different than the other people that lived there. If the boundaries between groups were fuzzy back then why should they be crisp today? It does not make sense to say modern Jews are the exclusive and sole heirs to the people who lived in the Holy Land 3,000 years ago, because 3,000 years ago, even the boundaries then were not so solid. Now maybe the ethnic boundaries were fuzzy 3,000 years ago, but what about religious boundaries? Because if the ancient Israelites were Jewish, then maybe only modern Jewish people can claim inheritance from them. But as Ben Shapiro doubtlessly knows, plenty of ancient Israelites in the actual Bible were drawn away from strict Judaism to the other religions of the people who lived in the region. The book of Judges is filled with stuff like that. Here's a passage from Judges 3. "And the children of Israel dwelt among the Canaanites, Hittites, and Amorites, and Perizzites, and Hivites, and Jebusites. And they took their daughters to be their wives, and gave their daughters to their sons, and served their gods. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and forgot the Lord their God, and served Baalim and the groves." And it's not just the people who intermixed with the non-Israelites, the rulers did it too. That's kind of the whole moral narrative that's going on in the Book of Kings. Even King Solomon strayed from God. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it was so, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not fully follow the Lord, as did his father David. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Moloch, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. That's why God curses Solomon. This doesn't sound like exclusively Jewish-controlled territory. It sounds like a very diverse and complicated society, with lots of interaction and intermarriage between the Israelites and the non-Israelites, and that's in the Bible. Here's the thing too, Judaism itself was not actually so different from the other religions in the region in the ancient period. Maybe that's why the Israelites were drawn so easily to other gods. If so many people in ancient Israel worshiped these other gods, at what point do we say this is just the norm? That's just from the Bible. When you look at archaeological and historical evidence, it becomes clear that monotheistic Judaism evolved over a long period of time from the polytheistic Semitic religion of the Near East, with lots of phases and idiosyncrasies in between that we just can't call monotheistic. That's what we call Yahwism. Yahweh was the most important god and the head of the pantheon of the ancient Israelites, but he wasn't the only god. This is actually pretty normal for the region. Certainly other societies in the Near East preferred certain gods, but weren't quite monotheistic yet. Assyria had Ashur, for example. Pure monotheistic Judaism may have only arisen with the Babylonian exile in the 500s BC. That's after the whole history of ancient Israel, and now into the classical period, basically. Professor Robert Noose describes this as the consensus among scholars. So the consensus is that monotheistic Judaism arose in the 500s BC. And of course, just because monotheistic Judaism developed around then does not mean that everybody in the region instantly converted to Judaism. Far from it. So what does that mean? It means that calling the region historically Jewish territory to the exclusion of other groups doesn't make any sense. Non-Jewish people lived there the entire time. Even the ancient Israelites themselves weren't exactly Jewish as we might understand Judaism to be today, as in a monotheistic religion. We're talking about 3,000 years ago. Here's what Ben Shapiro says next.
Even during the exile, there was continuous Jewish presence in the land. Islam, which is the religion of the Palestinian Arabs, was not even founded until the 7th century CE or AD. No independent Arab state has ever existed in the area known as Palestine. Myth number 2.
Here are two things I have to say in response. One, Ben Shapiro presents the fact that there was continuous Jewish presence in the land after the Muslim conquest as proof the land was, in some meaningful sense, Jewish territory to the exclusion of Muslim territory. But here's the thing. There was continuous Canaanite non-Jewish presence in ancient Israel, so wouldn't it count as ancient polytheistic territory then, using that standard? If some group of Baal worshippers took over the region and established the Republic of Canaan, or the Republic of the Amorites, or the Hivites, or the Perizzites, would Ben Shapiro support that? Probably not. Second, let's do some math, focusing on who controlled Jerusalem, the major city of the region, and for how long. Ben Shapiro said the Israelites entered the region in 1400 BC, which probably isn't true, but let's just go with it. The kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians, but Judah survived as a vassal to the Assyrian Empire, then to Egypt, then to Babylon, but around 587 BC, Babylon took control directly. So 1400 BC to 587 BC, that's about 800 years of Jewish control of Jerusalem. Now we just talked about how calling the ancient Israelites Jewish is a bit weird, but let's just give Ben Shapiro some charity. Next, the area was taken over by Persia. Now Persia seems to have allowed Jewish exiles back into the area, but it was still ruled by Persia, then by Alexander the Great, then Antigonus, then Egypt, then the Seleucids, then finally we get to the Maccabean kingdom under the Hasmonean dynasty in 167 BC. So finally Jewish rule again. And at that point, Judaism was a monotheistic religion, so Jewish rule. Jerusalem was controlled by Jewish people until, as Ben Shapiro pointed out, Rome took it over in 63 BC. So that's about another 100 years. So in total, Jerusalem was ruled by Jewish people for about 900 years before the modern period. Now, after the Romans came the Rashidun Caliphate, who took over Jerusalem in 637 AD from the Eastern Roman Empire. And then afterwards, you have various Muslim factions ruling over Jerusalem until 1099, when the Christian Crusaders took it over. So that's about 460 years for the Muslims. Then Saladin retook Jerusalem in 1187, which you might remember from that movie. Muslims ruled the city until 1228, so another 40 years, then regained it in 1244. Muslims ruled over Jerusalem until Britain took it in 1917, so that's another 670 years for Muslims. So in total, adding that all together, that's 1200 years of Muslim rule in Jerusalem, 900 years of Jewish rule, and by the way, nearly 800 years of Roman or Greek rule. So when Ben Shapiro says the region wasn't historically Muslim territory, there's really absolutely zero basis to make that claim, right? It's just a preference. Ben Shapiro prefers Israel, so he thinks the period of Jewish rule matters more than the period of Muslim rule, or even the period of Roman or Greek rule. It's just a preference. Here's another thing, by the way. Ben Shapiro says this:
Islam, which is the religion of the Palestinian Arabs, was not even founded until the 7th century CE or AD.
He says this to suggest that Palestinians only really started to exist after the foundation of Islam. He's trying to minimize Palestinians as much as possible. But here's the question: why do Palestinians have to be Muslim? Why is Islam, their religion, so relevant to this calculation here? Let's rewind back to the mid-1800s, before Zionism became a major movement and before Jewish Europeans came to Palestine in large numbers. If you don't know, the Turkish Ottoman Empire ruled over Palestine back then. Now, the Ottoman Empire didn't really have good census data back in the 1800s, but luckily this book, The Population of Palestine by Justin McCarthy, tries to produce some accurate demographic data. He estimates that of the total 340,000 people who lived in Palestine in 1850, about 300,000 were Muslim, 13,000 were Jewish, and 27,000 were Christian, so about 88%, 4%, and 8%. So the vast majority of Palestinians were actually Muslim, but there was a large Christian minority and also a Jewish minority too. What do we call those Christians and Jews? Do we call them Palestinian? Well, they lived in Palestine, didn't they? We can't call them Israeli because Israel didn't exist yet. Why exactly do Palestinians have to be Muslim? Well, if Ben Shapiro casts Palestinians and Islam as inextricably linked, then he can cast Palestinians as foreigners, since Islam was founded to the south. He also calls them Palestinian Arabs, and in fact a lot of people do, and Palestinians often self-identify as Arab, and nearly all of them speak a dialect of the Arabic language. But guess what? A lot of the Christian and Jewish people who lived in the Middle East also spoke Arabic. That was the lingua franca of the whole region, basically. Let's focus on the Jewish population of Palestine at first. James Finn, who served as British consul to Jerusalem in the 1850s, has a whole chapter on the Jewish community in Jerusalem in this period in a book he wrote. His descriptions should be pretty familiar to anybody who knows about Jewish people. Of the Jewish people in Jerusalem, there are the Sephardim, who speak Spanish in their family intercourse, being mainly descendants of the refugees from Spain and Portugal. There are also the Ashkenazim, who are mostly natives of Germany, Russia, and the Danubian principalities, who mostly speak European languages. He also identifies a small community of Arabic-speaking Moroccan Jews. So just like the non-Jewish population of Palestine, the Jewish population of Palestine predominantly spoke languages from elsewhere. Some even spoke the Arabic language. While the Moroccan Jews were supposedly a small population in Palestine in 1850, there were actually a lot of Jewish people elsewhere throughout the whole Middle East, and from the evidence we have, they mostly spoke Arabic or the other languages in the lands they lived. This is the population that we call Mizrahi today. You can learn more about Judeo-Arabic from this source, or Benjamin Harry's book, Translating Religion. Now, there's actually a whole social thing with Arabic in Israel, but my point is this: the non-Jewish population who lived in Palestine should not be counted as foreigners just because they spoke Arabic, considering lots of Jewish people did too. Should we count them as Arabs? Maybe. Maybe not. The lines between these groups are not as cut and dry as Ben Shapiro would have you believe, and applying the modern standards of, Palestine versus Israel back into the historical past is anachronistic. This neatly segues into another major myth that you see all the time, that all Muslims in the area are colonists from elsewhere. This is a pretty widespread idea. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu himself tweeted this in 2019. There's no connection between the ancient Philistines and the modern Palestinians, whose ancestors came from the Arabian Peninsula to the land of Israel thousands of years later. The Palestinians' connection to the land of Israel is nothing compared to the 4,000-year connection that the Jewish people have with the land. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich declared a few years ago that there are Arabs in the Middle East who arrived in the land of Israel at the same time the Jewish Zionist return began, after 2,000 years of exile, and some Arabs in the region do not like that. So what do? They invent a fictitious people and claim fictitious rights in the land of Israel just to fight the Zionist movement. This article from the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies is titled Palestinian Settler Colonialism, and it's more of the same from elsewhere. Here's the fact. While there has historically been a lot of migration into and out of the region, the indigenous population in Palestine was not replaced by Arab Muslims. Instead, all the evidence we have shows that it was mostly a case of the locals converting to Islam over many centuries and adopting the Arabic language. This article, New Evidence Relating to the Process of Islamization in Palestine in the Early Muslim Period, from a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, says, it is clear that in Palestine there was no Islamization as a result of mass sedentarization of newly arrived Muslims in Amshar or garrison towns, as was the case in Iraq and in Egypt. It is known, however, that Arab tribes were living in different areas of Palestine already from the Roman period and probably converted to Islam in the period following the conquest. Well, what about everybody else who lived there? Where did everyone go? The author contends it was likely a case of some Arab Muslims settling in the area, like he just said, and also mass conversions of the indigenous population to Islam in later centuries, after the initial conquest. While the author has some ideas, the field of scholarship isn't quite sure when these waves of conversion happened. The extent of the conversion of the local dhimmi population to Islam during the period under discussion here, and the proportion of Muslims in the population at its end, is not agreed upon. There are some who claim that when the Crusaders arrived, the majority of the population in Palestine was Muslim, while others maintain that there was still a large proportion of Christians at the time, and that the process of mass Islamization took place only from the 13th century onwards during the Mamluk period. So no, a large population of Muslims or Arabs did not settle in Palestine and replace the indigenous population. Some did settle, but it was mostly a case of religious conversion, which happens a lot in human history. That's nothing bizarre. Now we can look at genetic data too, which is what Netanyahu tried to do with his tweet. For example, this review of 22 studies about this issue says, modern Palestinian cohorts, both Christian and Muslim, exhibit a tight clustering affinity with Bronze Age and Iron Age Levantine samples from Megiddo and Ashkelon. In contrast, Ashkenazi Jewish samples are shifted significantly toward Southern European, Italian and Greek clusters. In fact, as the article says, the FST values indicate that Palestinians are genetically closer to the Iron Age inhabitants than any other modern group analyzed. So modern Palestinians show close genetic relatedness to the ancient population of Palestine. The Ashkenazi Jewish population shows a lot of European heritage. There are a bunch of other studies that show very similar things, and this shouldn't be surprising. This shouldn't be bizarre to people. That's just what happened in history. The Jewish community in Israel is a diaspora community. The Palestinians were there. What does this mean? Well, it means you can't call Palestinians foreigners, even if they do mostly practice a religion and language with origins elsewhere, and even if there was intermarriage throughout history of Palestinians with other groups, from Turkey, from Arabia, from Southern Europe, and from Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I'm not saying that Jewish people don't have heritage to the region, that they can't trace some of their ancestry to the people who live there. I'm saying Palestinians can. If Palestinians aren't indigenous, then nobody is. I want to address one last thing Ben Shapiro says. I've seen this all over the place, and it's just not true.
No independent Arab state has ever existed in the area known as Palestine.
So first of all, to be good faith, Ben Shapiro is not talking about all the Arab Muslim empires that ruled parts of Palestine over, how long did we say, 1,400 years, 1,200 years? He's talking about an Arab Muslim state that controlled exclusively Palestine, and it was centered in Palestine. I've seen this all over the place, and there has actually been that. The Jarahids, an Arab Muslim dynasty, ruled over Palestine as sovereigns in the late 900s and early 1000s AD. But also, guess what? There has never been an independent American country that controls Michigan and nothing else. And the current United States government doesn't count because we control other areas besides Michigan. Does that mean anybody can come in and conquer Michigan? Does that mean we can just ignore all the history of Michigan as part of a larger American country, i.e. the United States? No, because the only legitimate basis of a government is the consent of the governed. The past is not relevant to this. So far, Ben Shapiro is using what essentially amounts to nationalist blood and soil arguments. He's been talking about historical claims to the territory, that sort of thing. I've been arguing against those claims using the same rules that he himself established. I talked about genetics because Benjamin Netanyahu brought that up with his big tweet. But here's the moral truth of the matter. Even if Palestinians were Martians from Mars, it wouldn't make forcing them from their homes okay. No amount of history can justify an atrocity. If you want me to talk more about modern Palestine and Israel, consider supporting the channel on patreon.com/whatwhyhow because there's always a risk of demonetization. Thanks to those already do, and adios.